Okay, well, I'm going to start. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Wearable Sensor Technologies Health Challenges and COVID webinar. This is the first of two webinars to explore research undertaken with wearables to enable monitoring, exercise, rehabilitation in ageing communities. I'm delighted to co-chair this session with Professor Joan Condell from the School of Computing, Engineering and Intelligent Systems at Ulster University. But first, I'd just like to introduce myself. So I'm Joanne Rose, the Chief Executive of Health Innovation Research Alliance Northern Ireland. And this is a newly formed cluster to facilitate partnerships and innovation support and create an active environment for collaboration across the academic, clinical and business sectors to improve health outcomes, innovation and translation across Northern Ireland and globally, with global outreach. So I'm delighted to be chairing this session because it really fits into that remit, and we've got a really excellent lineup today. So just ahead of that, I just wanted to say a couple of words, really. It's an extremely important topic for wearables. And here today, we've got collaborators from Finland, Sweden, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to detail work that's been undertaken for the SENDoc programme, which is supported by the European Regional Development Fund and the Northern Peripheral Arctic programme, as well as outreach from those partners as well. So even before the pandemic, telehealth was growing. It was set to grow 27% in 2019. Now here we are in a different world in 2020. And even before that, it was due to grow by £7.5 billion of investment over the year, and to actually save £7.5 billion, sorry, for the National Health Service in the UK. But then COVID impacted and really has accelerated the adoption of this in healthcare, because face-to-face time in healthcare has been limited. And equally, it's accelerated some of the health issues in the ageing population with accelerated physical, cognitive and mental decline. And in fact, Age UK reported 20 to 25% of their cohorts reported increased muscle weakness, fall potential and real loss of confidence, as well as increases in cognitive decline reported. So I think that there's this dual problem and dual opportunity here. So really, during the pandemic, over half of health appointments were carried out remotely. So it presents a huge challenge, particularly in ageing, for communities and health systems, for physical rehabilitation, diagnosis and monitoring. And I think today we're going to explore the adoption of some of these new technologies, the testing, and really hear from the researchers, clinicians and engineers and data and digital scientists about access, utilisation and accuracy of these technologies. And I think it's really important to represent these voices. We've also got a panel later from across the academic, clinical and commercial sectors where we'll be discussing that further. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Condell to introduce the SENDoc programme with two excellent speakers and really delve into this subject more. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Joanne. Okay, so I'm just going to share my slides here. Okay, so the SENDoc project is a 4-year Northern Periphery and Arctic project, and SENDoc stands for Wearable Sensors to Support Independent Living in Ageing Rural Communities. Ulster University are leading the project with partners from Sweden, Cork and Finland, Republic of Ireland and Finland. And we have Sweden and Republic of Ireland speakers today. So the aims and objectives of the project are to introduce wearable sensor systems in ageing communities with the potential to support independent living, which has obviously become very important during this past year. We sought to assess the technical, clinical and social acceptability of devices and how they could impact on patients' healthcare delivery and rural communities. So we had 4 main partners, as I said: Ulster University, who are leading the project in Northern Ireland, Västerbotten County Council, Umeå University in Sweden, University College Cork, Tyndall Institute in particular in Cork in Republic of Ireland, and Karelia University of Applied Sciences in Finland. So in these 4 partners, we have computing experts in Ulster, clinical experts in Sweden, and technical engineering experts in Cork, alongside our physios in Finland. And we will have speakers from Sweden and Finland, Sweden and Cork today. Finland will be on the panel. So we also have some associate partners here. We had CoLab in Letterkenny, COT in Derry. We had the government Greenland, St Finbarr's Hospital in Cork, who ran a trial for us, and Karelia Joint Municipal Authority. So how do we contribute to the NPA, which is, as I said, the Northern Periphery and Arctic Programme? We're proposing new models of healthcare service delivery with communities. So new models we're trying to introduce wearables as remote monitoring systems. We're trying to deliver effective services to change aging rural population healthcare. We will enable novel approaches to meet patients' needs using innovative technology and platforms. So what we sought to do basically was to test a wide range of wearables. And the outputs that we were to do 4 demo projects. We ended up doing a lot more than that, which you'll see in our video here in a second. We tested a number of wearable sensor systems and sought to refine them to make them usable for independent living. We did a report on the current technologies at the start of the project, so where we were in time. We produced a guide then further into the project to wearable sensor technologies for home rehab. And towards the end of this project, in this next few months, we will propose a home-based rehab service delivery model. So we're now going to play a short video before we hand over to our first speaker. Okay. Partners, a physio partner in Finland, clinical partner in Sweden, and a technical engineering partner in Cork, as well as ourselves in Ulster. The core aim of the project is to test mobility, strength, balance, and also well-being and exercise through sensors. Can we use sensors to measure all of these things to support independent living?
When the project was initially written up and developed, it was thought that there would be one sensor system developed for one particular condition and distributed to all partners. When we started the project quickly evolved into working on multiple demos, multiple conditions, multiple technologies.
We have tested so far 17 different sensor systems that are connected to elderly persons' independent living. And we have a certain protocol where we test the accuracy together with golden standard equipment that we have. And the next step, if the system is shown to be accurate enough, we have tested them in real working life rehabilitation processes, both in clinics, in-home rehabilitation teams.
Our unit up in Västerbotten in Sweden is a test bed. We are doing a lot of testing, trying to develop better technology for care closer to the seniors in their homes. We have been looking at the frailty aspects and mostly on the risk of falling and risk factors for falling and how to measure them with connected health.
We have noticed that the sensors are not in the standard that we thought that they would be, but also we noticed that maybe also many things have to change in the hospital and in the healthcare service delivery model, because you need to have, for example, training to patients and to staff members. They need to know how to use these sensors, how to interpret these sensors, and they need to know where to put them so they can have repeatable measurements.
When developing this kind of activities and equipment, there has to be very close cooperation with computer engineers, computer scientists, and us rehabilitation staff as an end user.
As engineers and as scientists, we sometimes can be in a little box and not think too much about the uses and actually what you're making can actually be being actually used for. And of course, as an engineer, the chance to test so many technologies with real users, and in particular get some of our novel technologies out of the lab in a real life setting, like with real users, and finding out the good and the bad from our technologies.
It's fantastic to be able to join in the project because it's interdisciplinary. We are meeting colleagues from 3 other countries in other specialities. I think it's in the crossroads between the disciplinaries that the magic happens.
Okay, thanks, James. So just before we move to our speakers, I meant to say, if you have any questions at any part of this webinar, if you can add them in the chat, and then we'll take them throughout the webinar. So we have 2 speakers today, as I said, one from Sweden and one from Cork. So Anna will introduce herself, and as will John, and we will take questions after Anna's presentation. Okay, Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Joan. Let's see if we can get the technology working. So, can you see my screen?
Yep.
So, my name is Anna Nordström, and I'm a professor in public health and a senior consultant in rehabilitation medicine. And I have the fortune to run a test bed for technology development with focus on digitalization and connected health up in northern Sweden. So taking part in this project was fantastic for our clinic and for me myself as well. And during the project we've had, you can almost not have a meeting with healthcare angle today and not say the word pandemic, but it has influenced our project, but also made it even more relevant. And what we wanted to do from a clinical angle of our project is to see how can we help seniors stay home longer in their homes, and also help them in this endeavor, even if they are getting reduced capacity with aging. So we need to help them manage chronic diseases as they age. And this is, of course, a question also for non-seniors, but as we know, a lot of our diseases debut in the 70s. And we have the senior angle with a demographic that is continuously getting older in our northern parts in Europe. And we also have our geographical challenges with rural areas, as you know, and as well as cities. And we, of course, have our climate as well. I took the fortune of picking some Swedish pictures. We have a long country and we almost have sun in the south and snow in the north right now. But these are some of the challenges we are facing within healthcare and the transition. And saying something positive about the pandemic, I think, is that it has accelerated our healthcare transformation with probably more than 5 years. As a culture within healthcare, we are quite risk averse and we are quite resistant to change, for new ways to do things. And that is not only for us that is on the floor meeting patients, but it's also legal system regulations and compliance challenges that hinder uptake of common technology. And in the pandemic, COVID-19 has been a trigger that has led to the acceleration, because we have in this crisis been pushing through technology faster than we would have for tenders in this period in a lot of different places in our country. And what we want to do, and what SENDoc is all about, is trying to push the digitalization towards an inclusive, person-centered, connected healthcare. And we can do this with connected technology. So by using wearables, we can extend healthcare beyond the walls of our facilities today. There is a lot of ways to do this, but to measure and differentiate healthcare, we need the wearables. And of course, what we noticed in SENDoc is this going too fast, too soon? Do we need barriers for these safeguards that we, as a day-to-day business, thinks goes too slow, but we need them for quality standards and patient safety benchmarks? How is it about immature product launching? Is it cost more harm than it does good? How do we do product development without system implementation evaluation? And that is a really hard issue to solve within healthcare, because we want to know that the technology, of course, measure what it should measure. It helps affect the patient treatment, but we also, as a third step, want us to save costs within healthcare. We want to establish new way of doing things more efficiently as well. So in the end, it comes down to how do we make these developments stick in the longer run? And to do that, we really have to look at both technology and know-how. We have validated technology and we need risk identification. We need to know what we're going to look at and that we're doing it in the right way. To do that, in order to do that, we need robust, user-friendly hardware and software. We need also evidence-based risk identification as basis for the software development. There is a need not only to do things the technology-wise very skillful, we need to know what the need in the clinic is. And that we had the ability within the project to work together towards a report. And in this report, it was quite evident that this is what is needed. So if we can monitor and look and develop in larger cohorts, it's a good basis to later establish and using it in implementation within the healthcare, because that is when we're doing, actually, we are using it in the clinical day-to-day on large sets that needs, when it needs to work. So if we can get it to work in large cohort, it's a bonus. It's that what we want. But also that's when we get to know how good the technology was, and we can develop algorithms to see if what we should be looking at. So we need to know what to look for. And in SENDoc, we were looking at daily activity levels and risk for diabetes. There's something wrong with the picture. Muscle quality, bone quality, physical activity, and risk for falling. We've been looking at balance and risk of falling, as well as assessment of mortality risk as tools to improve long-term survival. And we've looked at sedentary behavior and risk of depression. So these are some aspects of frailty. Frailty is a very tricky thing to measure in a cohort, because what is it? It's a lot of different things. And these are kind of some of the markers within our population. So one of the first we did was look at risk prediction for diabetes. This is a tool to use when you want to know the risk of developing diabetes, or how do we prevent the development of diabetes. And what we could find in this collaboration project was that at the threshold of 4,500 steps per day, was actually those who went over had 60% almost lower risk of developing diabetes compared to those who were taking fewer steps. So if we can find information like this, we can give recommendation back in clinic, and we can also use it as guide to identify risk patients for further follow-up or differentiate healthcare. Another project, we looked into calf muscle quality and the risk of falling. Here, we followed them from testing and over 12 months and looked at what was factors that made them fall. In this cohort, we had over 2,200 seniors participating, coming into clinic and testing, and then we follow them for 6 and 12 months for falls. And then we can see that the calf muscle density, the quality of the calf muscle, was actually a factor for falling within this time, suggesting that if you use it, if you have a better activity and you use your muscle, you have a less risk of falling. And this is also one of those parameters we could look into when we are trying to evaluate risk for a single patient. We also looked into balance, and for balance, there is quite a lot of different components when looking at clinical testing. And what we looked into was a quite simple way of measuring balance that's called postural sway. That is, you're standing still and see how you can keep your body still as well and not swaying. This cohort, we looked into almost 2,400 that measured their sway in the beginning, and then we followed them for 12 months to see who would fall. And we could see there was quite evident risk factor for the risk of falling when measuring postural sway before. So this is also a possibility to use, for example, for risk prediction for coming falls within a year. We looked into mortality risk. We always want to know how can we improve our risk models. And this was a very good collaboration work within the project, where we looked at a series of machine learning techniques and using it in a cohort of almost 2,300 70-year-olds. How can we produce algorithms that we later can take out and use in risk prediction models within the healthcare? And we could see within the modeling we did that we could use these kind of modeling to look at mortality risk in the future. So right now we're looking into how to develop the model further and use it in health related scenarios within different cohorts as well. We also looked into the fact of how much you move, and is that a risk factor for developing depression? And we could see in a cohort, in this Swedish cohort, that when you were more inactive, there was an increased risk of depression. So the more still you were sitting down, sedentary behavior was in a dose response related to the risk of depression. So the more you moved, the less risk you had of being depressed. So these are some of the findings from very short from the findings we had within the cohort. and looking at different angles. Of course, there are more work needed to be done. But looking at this, it's evident that we need to know what to look out for within healthcare. We need the healthcare angle to know what is needed, what can we use in the clinical setting, what is useful. But we need the technology part to help us formulate these risk response and put them in. And now within the SENDoc project so far, we've done a groundwork for algorithm and risk identification and evaluation. Next phase is how do we implement it within healthcare. But looking at the meta-analysis for this work, we could say that wearables works in larger cohorts if the technology works. It's implementable within regular clinic and healthcare as well. We've measured, as I said, over 3,000 in this cohort. Acceptability for clinical use is overall good, both for health staff as well as patients, but there is a need to work more on usability. It's a large contributing factor for success. Also, wearables have the potential to differentiate healthcare, and performance can be made by caregivers and analyzed centrally or on place. So if we know what we're measuring, we can actually put it in hands of different kind of staff, healthcare staff, and we can let them with good software do diagnosis themselves, or we can collect data and do the analysis and the support from central healthcare. It has potential as a technology, but we need better algorithms and we need them to be specifically developed. So there is a need for collaboration between academia and larger cohorts, because in the cohorts, we can do this. We have a lot of values. We collect them at the baseline and then we see what happens in the cohort. So if we can combine the larger clinical cohorts with good technicians and then do implementation studies within the healthcare, I think this is the way to go from lessons learned from SENDoc. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, just a second. So, yeah, what I meant to say before I hand over to John now is that this is the first of 2 webinars. So we'll run another lunchtime webinar on Thursday, and we will have speakers from Ulster and Finland, the other 2 partners in SENDoc. Also apologise for some of the images in Anna's slideshow, but we will upload the slides and the recording from this webinar after we finish. So we're going to hand over to John now.
Okay, just share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Barton from Tyndall National Institute in University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of the demonstrator projects that we did during the SENDoc project, working with Parkinson's disease and utilizing wearable devices in that demonstrator. Tyndall is one of Europe's leading and largest research institutes for information communications and technology. We created out of the National Microelectronics Research Centre, which started in 1982. But Tyndall was established in 2004 through University College Cork and the Department of Jobs, Enterprise in Ireland, Enterprise and Innovation, included researchers from University College Cork, Cork Institute of Technology and Industry, and is host to a number of different large-scale centres, a lot funded by Science Foundation Ireland. Our expertise ranges from atoms to systems, as we say, a variety of applications, but primarily in the areas of nanoelectronics, microsystems, photonics. We have our own wafer fab facilities and theory modeling and design simulation.
Our mission is to be a global leader for deep tech innovation through excellence in research. We primarily consist of engineers, scientists, all sorts of engineers and scientists. But to get the clinical expertise, during this project we linked up with our colleagues in University College Cork and the Centre of Gerontology and Rehabilitation run by Professor Suzanne Timmins. As Joan mentioned about the webinar on Thursday, those of you who are joining again on Thursday, Professor Timmins will be a part of the panel on Thursday. And she's, as I said, based in University College Cork as well. And for those of you who are joining us from abroad and don't know too much maybe about Ireland or Cork, and this is Cork and the rest of it is not Cork. So Parkinson's disease is a chronic neurological, and I should mention again that Professor Timmins runs a Parkinson's clinic out of St. Finbarr's Hospital in Cork, which is again why we chose to focus on Parkinson's. But it's a chronic neurological disorder, and it increases with age. And for North American figures, it impacts roughly 3% of the population. The figure on the right here shows some of the associated symptoms. And one of the most common is tremor, which typically occurs at on one limb, starting affecting single arm or leg, and moves to be bilateral when the disease progresses. There are different types of tremor: static, postural, and kinetic. And these can be classified for different levels of severity: absence, and mild, moderate, and severe. The people with Parkinson's are evaluated with clinical assessments, including standardized tools, which the most common or the most used or notably used is the one from the Movement Disorders Society, the UPDRS. It's very difficult and complex to assess PD patients. Clinicians obviously have different backgrounds, different experiences, and again, it's a very subjective view. Their interpretations of the movements that are performed as part of this scale. And again, equally, the person who are the patient that actually comes to be assessed, it depends on their state at the time, whether they're tired, whether they're dehydrated, and again, the typical white coat syndrome like anxiety that might occur from people actually facing going to doctors. Currently, there are about 9,000 people with Parkinson's in the Republic of Ireland, and less than half of them are seen twice yearly by their specialists. I mean, this is predicted to double. This number is predicted to double over the next 30 years. So clearly, there's a clinical need to introduce in this area wearable sensors or remote rehabilitation, anything that can actually increase the number of assessments that patients actually have, or allow them to do it in their own home. But again, if the technology works, as Anna mentioned before. One of the first things that our clinical colleagues did was a usability study through focus groups with Parkinson's patients, and actually talked to the Parkinson's patients and talked about their wishes for wearable devices if they were able to, have anything they could from wearable devices. 4 themes that came out of these discussions were living with Parkinson's, maintaining your independence and the risk of falls, but the clinical usefulness, as again, the wearability. No one likes to have large, chunky pieces of technology on you, and I know that Auntie will talk to this on Thursday as well. And again, the facility for user feedback, whether it's to do with symptoms or whether it's actually to do feedback about medications. The importance of device features are shown here on the table on the left, with clinical value rating the highest from the 32 people that were actually interviewed. So, and again, the features within this category included reliability, the ability to reduce travel, and ownership of health, and supplementing their local care team. From a technology perspective, or from a sensors data collection perspective, that which those of us in the engineers were focusing on, the goal was to assess the tremor severity, assessed automatically by a number of sensors, off-the-shelf sensors, off-the-shelf sensors as well as novel sensors, but in combination with machine learning algorithms. And the classifiers that we implemented included k-nearest neighbors, logistic regression, decision tree, and random forest. And I would just like to apologize if anyone can hear any background noise there, because they appear to be cutting or trimming the ditches outside my house at the moment. Again, this is all the joys of actually working from home that we all suffer from nowadays. The off-the-shelf sensors that we actually chose to use included an inertial measurement unit from XSense, which gives position orientation and allows us to interrogate the raw inertial data, and EMG sensors from BTS to track muscle activity, including a novel wireless electronic glove developed by called the Action Sense glove, developed by our colleagues in Ulster University, and which contains bend sensors. So these sensors were placed on the patients in two sets or two repetitions. First set included the IMUs and the EMGs. On both hands and arms, the two IMUs strapped to the back of each hand, and 4 EMGs attached to underside of the palm, the back of the forearm, specifically on the abductor pollicis brevis muscle and on the extensor digitorum muscle. And the second repetition of the protocol involved just the right hand only, and included the Action Sense glove and one XSense unit strapped onto the top of the Action Sense glove. So the protocol consisted of hand function tests, which were adapted in part from the MDS UPDRS. And the modified movements which we checked were resting tremor, postural tremor with arms outstretched, kinetic tremor, tapping, hand opening and closing, and wrist pronation supination, which is turning your hands up and down. The 6 movements are performed initially wearing this device set 1 on both arms, and then they are repeated with the glove, or device set 2, the glove and the IMU only on the right hand. 20 people with Parkinson's participated in our study. They varied in age, PD stage, functional ability. We did not include anyone that suffered severe or late stage PD, because they would not have been physically able to travel to the study site and complete the hand movements. The movements were recorded, and the anonymized videos were sent to 8 PD specialists to rate the videos. And those specialists included neurologists, geriatricians, and specialist registrars in geriatrics. Okay, and again, I just have a couple of slides here showing some of the movements that we actually captured on a patient, and showing the movements, the exercises that were actually undertaken. So the resting and postural tremors, holding for 20 seconds, and then the kinetic tremor testing, tipping your chest or your finger to your chest and then out to a marker, and repeating it 5 times. The relevant sensor that we're actually using in this case would be the IMU. The next one, under the categories of hand bradykinesia, tapping index finger to thumb, repeating it 30 times. And I hope the videos are playing, but it doesn't particularly matter if they are or not, because again, you can actually just see what the participants would be doing. And hand opening and closing, repeating that 15 times. And again, relevant sensors in this case would be using glove, the EMG, and the IMU. And again, the protocol, which was passed through the ethical committees at UCC, and again included, which I didn't mention earlier, was that at any time if any of the participants were tiring or required anything, or needed a break or anything to stop, this was, of course, incorporated into the protocol, and the entire set of exercises from start to finish took no longer than an hour. And the final look at wrist pronation and supination. Move your hands up and down 15 times. I should also point out that to mention with regard to COVID, that these tests on our participants started before COVID, and then we were actually put into lockdown for quite a number of months before we were able to finish the test. And the amount of effort that our colleagues, our clinical colleagues in Suzanne's team, and again our own engineers that were working to actually get the tests actually up and running again. And first of all, contacting the participants again, who showed an incredible willingness to actually take part, even though we were in the middle of or coming out of a lockdown, or level 3 as we were actually calling it here in Ireland. And the extra steps that had to be taken in a different location in St. Finbarr's Hospital, the wiping down, the actual testing, the sanitizing of all the equipment, which did add significantly to the time for the scientists who were carrying it out. But all the efforts have made as much as possible to actually minimize any further interruption or difficulty for the participants. The graph on the right shows some raw data taken from this wrist pronation supination, and again, initially it's immediately clear, like with regard to 2 different participants there, the larger peaks in shorter time, showing how much faster it is in performing this exercise, like indicates a lower level of Parkinson's, whereas participant Y, with smaller peaks and taking a longer time to actually do the exercise, theoretically indicates a higher level of Parkinson's. So moving on to step 2 here, like after the movements are completed with the sensors and the glove, the anonymized videos were sent to the 8 clinicians for rating. So the interclass correlation coefficient is a measure of reliability, specifically reliability of different raters to measure subjects similarly, and it's important as it demonstrates that any scale is robust to changes in raters, and a score of close to 1 is obviously excellent and better. And for all the 6 exercises as itemized there, like this, the ICC ranged with a maximum of 0.6 and down to 0.28, and it shows that when presented with videos of hand movements, Parkinson's disease specialists interpret motor symptoms severity differently. And again, there is a need for an objective measure of this. And that's what we're actually hoping to develop by taking our scores and taking the rating scores that were actually given by the raters, and actually developing an algorithm to actually develop a standardized measure for this. So just to go through quickly the classification process, the raw signals collected by the sensors were what we used to classify the presence of tremor in those exercises completed by the 20 volunteers. Pre-processing of the data was first carried out, including filtering and segmentation. A number of time and frequency domain features were calculated for the data, and the data was then scrubbed and cleaned. All features were fed to a supervisor-based classifier developed in Python. The models, as mentioned earlier, that we consider for the classifier were the k-nearest neighbor, the logistic regression, decision tree, random forest, and the data set was split into training and testing data sets, and the F1 score was used as a metric to quantify the quantity of the goodness of fit, comparing the predictions of the classifier with the actual labels, before the final model was actually developed. And just one slide showing a result from the results. And again, this analytics is in its early stages, but the algorithm is by no means finished. But the results so far are promising. For each of these classifiers and for all of the exercises, this just shows a confusion matrix, which is this box in the middle here, which is a measurement or a performance measurement for machine learning classification, and incorporates 4 different combinations of predicted and actual values, including your false negatives, false positives, true negatives, and true positives. The table shows each of the 4 classifiers and how they compared for classifying the presence or absence of the postural tremor, and the K-nearest neighbor had the best results with neither overfitting nor underfitting. For all of the exercises that we have performed, the analytics that we've actually performed to date, the K-nearest neighbor is the classifier that is the model that is actually performing the best, and again in most of them has a very, very good our F1 score, relatively close to 1, apart from at the moment the wrist pronation and supination, and again the analysis is still ongoing. So to conclude and talk about potential, well, the future work is obvious that we have to refine and finish the algorithm, but it was clear from the work that we actually carried out and that our colleagues in the Centre for CPR carried out, was that the Parkinson's patients are familiar and they welcome wearable technology, but it has to be integrated with their overall clinical care. Unfortunately, the clinicians, particularly in the Republic of Ireland, see people with Parkinson's infrequently, and the gold standard clinical rating has a poor inter-rater reliability, indicating a need for an objective standard. Wearable sensors can facilitate continuous recording, capture critical events, and also bridging this gap between the face-to-face clinical visits and introducing a tool that can facilitate remote Parkinson's care and rehabilitation and assessment in a home environment. However, the finalization of an algorithm that we're actually currently developing will provide an objective evaluation of the PD presence with a high degree of accuracy. But this algorithm is not finished yet and needs to be finalized and actually are tested and finalized further. And thank you very much. If you have any questions.
Okay, John, thank you. I'll just share my slide here. Okay. Right, so I have a couple of questions here on the chat. Anna, first for yourself, from Deirdre, how many people make up a large cohort, Anna?
As a researcher and a professor, I would say start out with saying it depends. It depends on what you're measuring and what you want to accomplish. When looking at statistic data, looking at risk algorithms, for example, for mortality and similar, you would like cohorts, maybe depending on the variables. We use, in Sweden, we have the Swedish gold treasure trove, and that is our national register where we have social security numbers and we can track individuals in different registers, and we're quite liberal when we're using it for research. So we can use a few million to look at outcomes, and when we do that, we can take into consideration also factors that can affect that you don't see when you have too few factors, and then you have to go up in the cohort size. Looking for clinical factors like a common disease like falls or diabetes, it depends on how many variables you want to put in, as we call them confounders, that we want to find. And when it is register research, we usually say a large cohort from around a couple of thousand and upwards. But when we're looking at objective data, they are usually very rare, those big set of of cohorts, looking at things that John is working on, that is technology development in the early phases when you do iterative development. Those cohorts might be in the range of 10 to 20 people. So it's difficult to give a straight answer, but what you want to do is look at the cohort and how many confounding factors, and then talk to statisticians and let them guide you in what we call a power analysis, and that will give you some indication to what the cohort is.
One thing we learned as a partnership in SENDoc was that Sweden, particularly around the Umeå area, have a huge cohort of 70-plus-year-olds that they bring in regularly for assessment. I think Anna now has nearly 5,000 in that cohort. 6, okay.
Yeah, it's going up.
So one other question, Anna, before I ask John a question. In your research, what are the main factors that potentially affect mortality rate?
I would say medication factors, comorbidity, how many diseases you have, is large factors.
Okay.
As well as overweight as an early risk indicator for coming cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But now we're talking, of course, in a cohort, not the individual.
Yeah. Okay, and one for John. For your graph around risk pronation, what do you mean by apparently? So is there not a direct relationship between the tremor frequency and the severity of Parkinson's?
Yes, there is. Again, I think I was being very conservative with my speech there and during the slide until we've finalized and published the paper, etc. But I mean, there is a definite relationship between tremor frequency and severity of Parkinson's.
Okay. Right, thanks, Anna and John. So there we have 2 of our 4 partners, and Anna has gave very much a clinical perspective on wearables, whilst John has given one specific perspective from the engineering side of things. So you can see John's approach and Anna's approach, even to how they present the results, are completely different. And that was one of the joys of working in this project. We had 4 different groups of experts here, all taking different angles on it. Right, I'm going to hand over to you now, Joanne, to chair the panel.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Anna and John. Really fantastic talks, and I think you've really set this panel up. So now we've got about 20-25 minutes of panel questions, and I'd like to bring our panel in. So thanks for turning your cameras on. Great. So I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves, but initially, so we've got Adrian Condon, who's the Chief Technology Officer of Be Secure. We have got Paul Moorhead, who's the Chief Research Officer of Cradle Limited. So both companies, startup companies and scale-up companies set up in Northern Ireland. We've got Geraldine Lavery, who is the strategic lead for the Dial Centre in Northwest Regional College in Northern Ireland. And I'm going to ask Geraldine to explain a bit more about the Dial Centre as well. And I'm delighted to welcome Melina Navala as well, who's a physiotherapist at the Karolia University of Applied Sciences in Finland as well, to give that clinical and healthcare professional perspective. So welcome, panel. If I can, I think I will start at the top of the slide. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Moorhead. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Cradle, and I was the founder back in late 2016. Cradle was set up to enable independent living by older adults and vulnerable people, and we kind of evolved to the position of kind of anticipating a confluence between a number of technologies, the kinds of technologies we're talking today, sensors, used in health monitoring and management, but also addressing the big challenge of social isolation, which has obviously been amplified hugely by COVID. So we tried to turn the TV set into a social hub, but also the point of integration for medical devices within the home.
Great, thank you. And then Elena Navala, please introduce yourself and your connection to the program.
Hello, I'm Elena. I have been working 3 years in SENDoc project. I'm a physiotherapist, starting my PhD in University of Jyväskylä. Here in Karelia, our team consists of 3 physiotherapists, so we are practical workers. So it has been really a nice journey to learn something about wearable sensors.
Fantastic, thank you. And Geraldine, please tell us more about your role and the Zile Institute.
Hi, I'm Geraldine Lavery, and I am a manager at Northwest Regional College. And DIAL stands for the Centre of Design and Innovation for Assisted Living. And basically what it is, it's a high specification home simulation environment here in the northwest of Ireland. It offers a single site demonstrator for a continuum of solutions, technology, equipment, combined with workforce skill sets, which are all targeting a promotion of independent living at home. So basically, in terms of SENDoc, it's 2 aspects to it. One is the opportunity to engage with workforce upskilling, and secondly, to create an opportunity to give exposure to wearables and other technologies to older people and other end users and their caregivers in an effort to promote their adoption and usability and acceptability. So basically that's DIAL.
Fantastic, thank you. I think it's much needed. And finally, Adrian Condor as well, please.
Hi everybody, I am CTO for BeSecure. So at BeSecure, we're a next generation biomedical algorithm development company. So we develop software for analysis of biosignals from the body. We're mainly focused on ECG, but most recently we've branched out a little bit. We are licensing that software to a number of different companies. Our main customers are next generation wrist wearables. So next generation of smartwatches and things like that. We have about 36, 37 engineers and scientists in Northern Ireland. And we have license agreements with the top 3 biomedical silicon companies. Most recently, we received FDA clearance for our HeartKey software. Yeah, we're really pushing forward in terms of next generation technology for sensing of the body.
Fantastic. So thank you. Welcome, panelists. So I've got a number of questions and I'm going to come to you in turn. And the first one really is a very broad one to kick us off, which is how has the wearable industry changed over the past 5 years and probably over the last 7 or 8 months as well? And what are your predictions on how it will change in the next 5 years? I'm going to come to you first, Adrian, but I think it would be really good as well if you could just define wearable for us as well, because I think it's a very broad scope.
Yeah, sure. So you've seen actually that the last 2 presentations give a lot of examples of the types of research wearables that are out there. I mentioned that we're heavily involved with the semiconductor industry, who license the silicon for a lot of startups and established companies to develop their technology on. So we get a little bit of early insight into the wearables that are coming. People are familiar with smartwatches. We're seeing patches, advanced patches in development for continuous and home monitoring, smart clothing. There are even projects out there in terms of smart toilets that can do sensing. So I'll not go into too much detail there. So we are seeing an explosion. Really now biosensing is going across IoT devices, and really yeah, new ideas, new concepts are coming. So in terms of sort of the wearables that I'll talk about or refer to today, I'm more focused now on the wrist wearable side of things, patches and smart clothing applications.
Fantastic, thank you. And Geraldine, from the other end of the spectrum, you know, what are you seeing coming through, and how has that changed in the last 5 years, and what do you see coming from your perspective, reaching the clinic and the patients?
see. Well, basically, my environment is very much focused on the home environment more so than the formal clinical setting. So I would say to you that the speed of translation into home environments is fairly slow. Outside maybe the mainstream technologies, they're really, it's fairly patchy. We've experienced more of the maybe bespoke health technologies for people who are particularly vulnerable, but the mass adoption, I think, is a big gap in terms of bridging that gap. And I think that's the piece of work that has to be done. So, I mean, that's what I would say. Plenty of use maybe of the mainstream techs, the Alexas, etc., and maybe the other extremes, but it's that middle continuum that I think we're missing in terms of the adoption in the home environment.
Fantastic. Alina?
Well, I have to say that before SENDoc project, I didn't know anything about wearables. So it has been really interesting journey until now. But I have to say that because we're working in the practice, there should be more collaboration with companies, universities, and social and healthcare professionals to develop these devices more accurate, usable, low cost. There's much to do, so maybe that's it.
This is just the beginning then, Alina?
Yeah, just the beginning. Yeah.
And Paul, from your perspective?
I think the points have been well made by the rest of the speakers. I mean, we've gone from promise, I think, to practical product in many cases. That will speed up, and I think we will see convergence, and that increasingly these won't be distinct special devices. There will be capabilities that we move into things that are already in the home and being used. You know, the smart wristwatches, obviously you can see what way that's going, but clothing and other things that you already have in the home, TVs with cameras that will start to do things they don't do today. And we can push more intelligence out to them rather than it being new devices constantly rolling out into the home.
Absolutely, and I think if I can also ask all of you, and I'll come straight back to you, Paul, about, you know, have you seen an acceleration in the last 7 or 8 months of people back sort of knocking on your door to see how they can adopt this faster? How's COVID impacted?
Well, I mean, big time. The point was made, I think, several times earlier about how telehealth has gone from a concept to a practical reality. Before March, the statistic I heard was that only 2% of GP practices would give video consultations. In practice, it's 99% plus at this point. Everybody can do it. So as came out from some of the presentations, it was never really about the technology. It was about the bureaucracy, fears over security, and various other things. So we've seen that a compelling event can make a lot of things happen. And the end of COVID, hopefully within a few months, vaccinations, it's not going to reverse all of that. These changes, I think, are irreversible and will drive ever faster adoption. Apart from, though, the changes brought about by COVID in terms of demand, and we've seen a huge ramp up in people looking for ways to enable social connectivity for those that are isolating, those tragically trapped in care homes and unable to see loved ones, even perhaps those terminally ill in a couple of cases where we've been delighted to help. Really quite, you can really get quite emotional about some of the things that we've been able to do. But it's also changed the investment landscape as well. So companies like ourselves working in this space, VCs are pivoting towards that. Tech companies have not really been hampered in terms of their ability to execute by COVID. Home working was something we did a lot of anyway. So we can still execute. And the VCs can now see that this is a space really to direct more of their funds towards.
Thank you. Adrian, do you have anything to add to that?
In terms of the
how COVID's impacted. So in the last few months, have you seen a massive acceleration from your side, or do you think it'll take time to filter through?
No, I agree with everything Paul is saying. Certainly if we talk about ourselves, we've had the impact of COVID. There have been some advanced research projects that were funded being cancelled. We had a lot of work in automotive biosensing, that sort of slowed down. But then there's been a counter to that. There's been an acceleration in interest in supporting new solutions or existing solutions for home monitoring. One of the NHS trusts we're working with, they're building a new hospital with 30% less beds deliberately because they see the future in technology and its ability to keep people out of hospital, systems and trust and data compliance, which allows doctors and cardiologists to actually trust the data from people using devices in the home. So big changes are happening, and definitely it's been accelerated by COVID.
Yeah, fantastic. Actually, Alina, I wondered if you've experienced that, about especially bringing in Adrian's point about trusting the data from the healthcare professional perspective.
Yeah, in Finland, this COVID situation have forced therapists to use remote connections and telerehabilitation, and it would be interesting to combine wearable sensors to remote connections to therapists to get objective data about, for example, gait. So that's really interesting combination to develop in future also.
Yeah, absolutely. And Geraldine, have you been able to operate during the pandemic in the Dial Centre?
Well, it's like most environments, we've had to just go virtual. But I mean, like everybody else, the need has not gone away. If anything, it's escalated. And probably the big thing in terms of our space is the growing interest in the social care workforce, who have come into particular profile during COVID. And there's an appetite now to maximise their potential in terms of the health solution. So, I mean, certainly the engagement has continued with the range of employers for social care in the period. And we anticipate now some considerable leap forward in thinking about an upskilling plan for social care workforce, the domiciliary care workforce, particularly home care support, whichever definition you want to adopt, in that they need to be seen as key partners in supporting older people in terms of their confidence to engage with technologies, and also for that section of the workforce to be engaged in a real informed buy-in about the true value of technology to enable their clients, and for it to be an actual contribution to health improvement. And there's a trust issue there for that section of the workforce as well, I think. So there's education about digital competence, but there's also an education about a buy-in to the value of wearables and technology, and how it really can enhance the entire lived experience of people.
Absolutely. I think it's a problem with multiple issues there. So if I'm just going to sort of move the topic on slightly, if we were able to think about sort of the next big issue in adoption or in utilising these wearable technologies, I'm going to come to you, Alina. What would you say is the most important factor for you for adoption of these or promotion of these technologies with either elderly people or health professionals? What would you say is the most important factor that we need to address now?
Yeah, our experiences with older people is that they are very positive towards different kind of devices, open-minded. They are interested to hear the results of, for example, gait or balance. So I would say that in the end, it's not about the age after all, because we are all individuals. I would say that, because we are different. It's not about the age in the end.
Absolutely. Geraldine, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, in terms of the adoption, I suppose I think it's just the continuous exposure and confidence raising, so that people develop a confidence about usability, a familiarization. That I mean, to kind of echo many of the sentiments other panelists are saying, it's about integrating these into the mainstream almost, that they're both usable and acceptable, and it's really as well about again, repeating what I've said about making sure that the range of workforce understand the value of their contribution to data and to the use of data to support good predictive interventions. And I think these are the things that will accelerate adoption.
Thank you. And if I can bring in Paul here, as well. So what are the commercial sector, what are the companies doing to promote technology for elderly people, or what can the common misconceptions be about this group? I think Elena touched on it very well about, even we're all different.
Yes, absolutely. So from the start, we wanted to partner with digital devices, with wearable businesses, and we're getting somewhere with that, albeit slowly. The main problem we've actually found has been about the ergonomics, the usability of these technologies, and there's a lot of very, very smart people, with engineering and biomedical skills who are designing the smarts into it. But I think for a while, and to some extent even now, not enough thought is going into the wearability, the comfort, and the ergonomics of some of these things, particularly if these are devices to be worn all the time. I've not sure which company it was, but it was a very large company. We evaluated a wearable band with falls and detection, panic button, all the rest of it. And even I, as an able individual, couldn't put it on my wrist with one hand. Just the way the strap had been designed, I couldn't get it on, and it was actually very uncomfortable. It rubbed against whatever somebody can remind me what the name is for that knobbly bone on your wrist. It's something or other condyle protrusion, I think. But anyway, it was uncomfortable. Some have been incredibly unfashionable, bulky, in white, for example. I don't think elderly people want to look like people on parole who've been tagged any more than the rest of us do. If this is something that's going to be part of their lives, it has to be fashionable and stylish, and the kind of thing they're happy to take off a designer watch to put on instead. So we're seeing more of that. We're also seeing a longer battery life, which is a big problem. If this is an elderly person living alone, they may not be in a position to recharge the device, take it off, put it back on again, every day. So, a week's worth of battery increasingly is important. But I think it's the ergonomics now which is a different kind of design skill, which needs to kind of layer in on top of the engineering that went into the sensor itself.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting feedback, Paul, as well. I think that's something to think about as these technologies are adopted, to make sure that the patients are involved in the design. So I just wondered, Adrian, if obviously you're from the algorithm side, do you get involved in user experience and things like that for healthcare professionals or patients? Are there things we need to think of there?
Yeah, absolutely. The efficiency of the algorithms and the accuracy of the algorithms and all of those things will affect the usability. As Paul said, there are devices that exist and they are, I suppose, accurate to a certain degree, but they don't look very good. They're not very accurate. And I think the typical medical devices that we see out there they don't look anything like an Apple type of device, and there is a demand by especially older people. They want things that look pretty good. So yeah, I would echo usability is a major feature that's required.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really important to think about all of these factors, and actually just to move on, Geraldine, I was going to ask you as well, in your role, what sort of competencies do you think that we need to begin to develop in order to either utilize the data or train up and help the elderly population adopt these technologies? What do we need to be learning now?
Yeah, I think it's pretty diverse, because the tiers of health and care workforce that you're talking about can be highly differentiated. So to me, if I can use exemplars, I have referred already to the importance of the domiciliary care workforce, but also there'll be the like of occupational therapists, which are like a prescribing profession and critical to design and rehabilitation packages. So I think that their postgraduate education, so perhaps they will come with a digital competence, but they would need a competence around awareness of choice or packages of product that can be put together. But then equally at the other end of maybe tier 2 workforce, there are big gaps in terms of digital competence there. So there's a whole agenda in Northern Ireland about developing e-practitioners at every tier of the health workforce. So I think it's a combination of knowledge, skills around digital, but then I would also say there are soft skills around coaching motivation, and really, a sense just of, I'd say, collective ownership and integrated thinking about the value of all of these solutions for actual end users.
Absolutely. I think you've highlighted a huge shift that's going to need to occur, and that's beginning to occur to help adoption. Alina, do you have a perspective about, I guess, from the healthcare professionals' perspective, from getting this onslaught of data from the wearables? What skills do they need to be developing, or how do we need to focus on helping them utilize this in the future?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because if you think about face-to-face therapy situation, earlier you could only focus on the client, and now you suddenly have some kind of device, and you have to know how to use it and interpret the data. So it's totally different. It changes the situation. We have done qualitative research in SENDoc project, and there's few themes that raises up. We interviewed physiotherapists after they used different kind of wearables. So there's technical use, how to use the device, or the application, how to put the sensor on, for example. Second theme was the motivational aspect. There could be a motivational aspect for the patients, physiotherapists think. So this is really interesting, because physiotherapists think that there's some kind of motivational aspect. So it would be really nice to interview the clients also about this topic. There's also this own ability and competence related to use of wearable technologies, and it was all about interpreting the data. It's really difficult, because you have used your eyes and subjective assessments before, and now you have numbers and parameters and what to do with them. So it's really new thing. Yeah, and also physiotherapists think that this kind of devices are good tools for rehabilitation. For example, monitoring the progress of rehabilitation. It enables objective data, which is new. So they think it's really positive, new ways.
Yeah, and one thought I have as well is about integration of the data, and there'll be data from multiple sectors, so or multiple different wearables or in-home devices, and how we're going to overlay that. So I wondered, Adrian, if you had any thoughts on that. How are we going to understand how to utilize these different types of data across the different wearables and health sector?
Well, I think you're seeing now a shift from a lot of the big technology companies, and health data is the new oil, the new gold. So all of them are up to something in terms of the ability to aggregate data from multiple devices or tap into devices that are not related at all. So you will see very large health platforms continuing to develop, continuing to try and integrate with existing health institutions, and making it much easier. We'll use more devices. That data typically goes to these big tech companies. Then it's whether they're prepared to share it with the likes of hospital platforms, and that continuous data is incredibly important and will change healthcare, because instead of actually dealing with the issue at the end point when it already exists, the continuous data allows you to intervene very early. So predictive and preventative healthcare is a major sort of change that we'll see. And as I said, the technology companies understand that, the big technology companies understand that, and they're going for it with their strategy. So it's positive in many ways, but it's also quite concerning as well.
You've raised an important point as well. As previously, all the data was in the healthcare setting, and the companies wanted to access that data. But now we might be seeing a shift to some of these consumer products, and also the clinical wearables, that the data is actually shifting out into the commercial sector, and how does the clinical sector actually interact with that and understand how that can modify care and outcomes. Paul, have you got any thoughts on that, about integrating different data sets from your home, the cradle setting, with other data inputs?
Well, you're absolutely right that that's what we want to do. It's what we need to do. And I think Adrian's points were well made. I defer completely to Adrian and Lena on the kind of analytics and machine learning side. That's something I understand. The challenge for companies like Cradle is actually accessing skills. Because well, on first, I guess the actual ability of skills and people really experience the challenge. We are doing a project on innovation centers on trying to interpret all of the data that we can gather, which is potentially a mountain of stuff, and extract some meaningful understanding of behavior, and then both the short-term sudden changes that might, trigger an immediate intervention, which could be important, but more particularly, what journey is somebody on, and what's the point at which to intervene, so to turn our care provision to proactive, preventive, rather than, as most care systems around the world today, they're horribly reactive. They do a great job when things go badly wrong. They don't do anything really to prevent it. And health insurance has tended to operate on that model as well, but more and more insurance companies, health insurance companies, are thinking how much cheaper it might be to respond to those early indications of decline, and release money from an insurance policy effectively to prevent that fall through physiotherapy or changes in the home. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and that's one of the things that obviously companies like Cradle want to enable.
Exactly, Paul. I think, and then all of our speakers, I think you've really highlighted that there's such a broad scope and a broad audience and group of stakeholders that we need to pull together. And it's fantastic to see in this that the SENDoc program, cross country and also cross specialty collaboration to really try and understand those problems and focus on those challenges. And I just wanted to highlight something from John's talk as well. He talked about standardization in Parkinson's disease, and that clinicians monitor the disease visually differently, and perhaps that there's a chance to actually develop new diagnostics that standardize the diagnosis. So that would be interesting with all of the caveats that brings as well. Unfortunately, time is against us. I think we could have carried on talking about this for a long while. But so I just wanted to thank our four panelists for their contributions today. Really interesting discussion that I hope we can delve into, and potentially the audience here on the call can react to, and we can follow up afterwards as well. I'd like to hand over to Joan now, who's going to wrap up. But just before that, I just wanted to thank the organisers as well. So Carla and James and Joan for pulling this together and really making it run well. So thank you very much. Over to you, Joan, to wrap up and give your final thoughts and final words.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. Okay, I'm just going to share a couple of slides here. So. Okay, I've been summarising some thoughts from the speakers. So from Anna's mainly, she commented that SENDoc has accelerated healthcare transformation in Sweden, who are typically risk averse, but she highlighted the need for robust evidence and to show the need for that transformation. She specifically in SENDoc looked at false prediction. She has a huge data set, as I said. She's now 6,000 over 70-year-olds, and we have spent a lot of time just downloading that data, never mind analysing it. She has found generally that the acceptability is good and usability is a huge factor, which most of our speakers have referred to, and panelists. So in Cork then we had the specific Parkinson's demo, and John has alluded to the fact that there's up in 9,000 with Parkinson's known in the Republic of Ireland alone. and they typically have just 2 visits a year to their clinician. So you could see how remote monitoring could massively help these patients. He did a test on 20 patients in St Finbarr's Hospital where they were given a glove and IMU sensors. They did a series of exercises to check their hand function. And this whole trial showed potential for remote monitoring with patients with Parkinson's using wearables, but it needs to be integrated with their overall clinical care. So in terms of the panel then, Cradle is a hub for connected devices in the home. The Dial Centre train and upskill OTs and other healthcare professionals, and they're very focused on independent living at home. Be Secure, do algorithmic development, and first focus on biosignals, ECG, and looking at others also. So we've all seen an explosion in wearables. Some of them are useful, some of them are not. And most software and hardware people are trying to add more and more intelligence to those wearables. The speed of the translation into the homes is quite slow in that mid-range, as Geraldine said. COVID has certainly accelerated the adoption of wearables into healthcare, and we know across Europe and globally we have a growing ageing population. So I'm sure we all know on this webinar today, also pre-COVID, GPs wouldn't take a phone call from you, but now you can't get anything but a phone call from GPs. In the VC world, VCs are pivoting more towards this new landscape of remote monitoring healthcare, and they're putting more money, investing more money in those types of startups. And Adrian gave the example of the NHS in a test he had seen. They were actually building less beds in a new hospital, and with the plan to have more technology, more healthcare in the home, so to speak. Geraldine made the point that there is an appetite for social care health solutions, and there is definitely value in tech, but we need trust and we need training. In terms of promotion of tech factors, we need to make them acceptable. So Elena made the point that elderly are generally positive. That's what they find in Finland, and certainly I find that too here, and especially during COVID and my own personal experiences with elderly and technology. So age isn't really that relevant. More important, it needs to be, the wearable technology needs to be integrated into the mainstream, needs to be usable, and we need to assure people that it's trustworthy as well. We need to use more data and show how we use more data for prediction of health problems. Usability, again, very important, and also Paul and Adrian both touched on the fact that we need to focus more on ergonomics, what it actually looks like, as well as being aware that it needs to have a good battery life. We also touched on competencies and training. So we need to make the healthcare professionals more aware of what's available, the packages of product, wearable product that they can get, and upskill them both digitally and on those options. Elena and Geraldine both touched also on soft skills and coaching and motivation, and how we need to have a collective ownership of this piece. And finally, on the data, Paul and Adrian talked about aggregation of data and how big health players are integrating. Is this a positive or a negative? It remains to be seen. And similar to the States scenario, insurance companies are becoming more and more interested in wearables and how they could reduce their premiums based on the availability of these wearables to track health and to predict problems with health. So I think that's about it, Joanne. Our next webinar is on Thursday at the same time, so 12:30 to 2 again, and we will have speakers from Finland and Ulster. Thank you everybody for joining, and we're just 1 minute to go, so we just about finished on time. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel and thanks to Joanne as well. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.